Leo Sylvester Hannan was born in Auckland in 1900. His parents were recent immigrants from Ireland. Hannan's upbringing was tough. Those reasons will become self-explanatory shortly. If you could summarise his life in 2 words, these would be loner and unlikable. He would rub noses up wherever he went, including amongst the criminal underworld. Hannan's long life in and out of New Zealand justice system began at a young age, when in 1912, aged just 11, he was caught along with his cousin Thomas burgling a house, for which the pair were sentenced to 6 strokes of the birch and sent for a stretch in what we would now call Borstal. It is an understatement to say that Hannan's clan was large, nor a blimp on the police's radar. Leo Hannan was one of 11 children, 5 boys and 6 girls. His mother and father were what we would now call deadbeats. The children were left to their own devices, which we would now call ferals. That said, only 3 brothers Charles, Leo and John Joseph ended up on the wrong side of the law. Not that I can be totally sure. That's because of the widespread usage of nom de plumes, like say those John Joseph, employed at various times being when questioned by the police or fleeing a creditor. Moriarty, Montague, Jackson, Wilson, Newton, Sullivan, Hill, Burgess, Levy, to mention but a few. Joe's police record was every bit as long as his more notorious brother. Another brother, Edmund, did time under the name Charles Snow and Charles Francis. So back to the ginger-haired 5'6" Leo, his back catalogue of crimes, which is what I could locate at first glance and bound to be incomplete, but gives you the gist and breadth and scope of his criminal record. At no stage will you warm to him. No one ever did. 1918, stealing motorbike handle frames from a Whanganui dealer and then going on the run. 1922, turning over the rooms of his fellow occupants in a King Country boarding house. 1926, with another ratbag called George Allen, broke into the commercial hotel in Auckland and then made a failed attempt to blow up the safe at a timber importer called Rosenfield's. All he succeeded in doing was blowing the office apart, for which he got 18 months. 4 months into his sentence, he escaped and was recaptured in Fielding 4 years later. 1930, after a crime spree ended up in prison in Waikato, which he then escaped from and headed down to Dunedin in the South Island, where he was recaptured, charged for the robberies he committed on the run, imprisoned in Dunedin. Yes, he escaped, but was recaptured this time within days. End of 1931. Within weeks of being released and back up in the North Island, he was charged with breaking and entering in Napier, with £6 in cash, with £6 in property. Got another 18 months in the slammer. 1933. Back down south, he got 2 months in Timaru. 1934. Still in Timaru, he was wanted for a string of bicycle thefts and went on the run. 1938. Still in the South Island, he was collared in the middle of an attempt to blow up a safe at a hotel in Greymouth. Ended up in Christchurch prison, which he escaped from. Was recaptured a couple of days later. If you're wondering by now how he got to escape all the time, it wasn't from his cell. Because he was considered a low-risk inmate, that's to say not a violent one, he was allocated to prison farms and the likes outside the walls, and then did a runner. 1943, 2 months for draft dodging. 1945, breach of probation. 1950, now to number 1, aged 50, Hannan was staking out the deserted Wellington railway station on the 11th of August, late one evening, when he was discovered leaving the toilets and confronted by the night watchman, 54-year-old Frederick Stade. Hannan took to Stade with an iron bar in a brutal confrontation in which Stade's brain was literally bashed out. The police located Hannan later that morning with his face, hands and clothes splattered in blood. In the cuff of his trousers was a piece of flesh and brain matter. The jury took just 17 minutes to find him guilty. The Chief Justice, Sir Humphrey O'Leary, sentenced him to life imprisonment with hard labour. Auckland Prison, Mount Eden. This routine wasn't to be the cosy days of tendering gardens like before. His days would now be spent breaking rocks in a quarry beside the prison, when, you guessed it, he escaped one day on detail, 1955, made his way to Auckland train station, and purchased an overnight ticket to Wellington, all in prison garb. That's where the police were waiting for him to arrive. I'm not sure if Hannan holds the record for the most escapes from New Zealand prisons, at 4, 1930 twice, 1938 and 1955, but he must go close. 1955 though, that was the last time he left confinement. By 1960 his health was failing. 1962 he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. In his final days he was transferred to Auckland Hospital, where he called his former lawyer, George Joseph. On his deathbed, Hannan confessed to Joseph that Stade wasn't the only person he'd killed.
There were 3 more.
1942 and 1948. Sworn to secrecy, George Joseph kept Hannan's confession secret for 2 decades. Well, not entirely secret. In 1982, Joseph penned a book on New Zealand's unsolved murders, titled By Person or Persons Unknown, in which the 3 deaths, 2 cases, were chronicled. Joseph didn't mention Hannan by name, referring to him simply as X. The book was read by a retired policeman who was on the first case, and like many police investigations, there were details not in the public domain, yet featured in this book. The copper then learnt Joseph was the lawyer for Hannan, and put 2 and 2 together, and he also knew Hannan was the prime suspect in the case he was on 40 years earlier. What's more, after pointing up the tie-up in the 1942 case to current members of the force, when they looked at the chapter on the unsolved 1948 murder that featured in the book, the same pattern appeared. It pointed straight to Hannan, and with Joseph was questioned by the ex-copper and the current coppers as to whether X was him, he admitted it was, starting with 2 elderly sisters, Annie Smythe, 62, and Rosamund Smythe, 74, township of Wairoa, east coast of the North Island, 22nd of August 1942. Annie was the dominant of the 2 spinsters, a Bible-bashing Salvation Army brigadier who had spent over 3 decades as a missionary in Japan. Rosamund was profoundly deaf and had a mild mental disability. It was Annie that made a nuisance of herself around the Hawke's Bay town of 5,000. With New Zealand under threat of being invaded, her affinity with the Japanese didn't win her any friends, nor her impromptu visits to the local pubs lecturing punters of the evils of the demon drink. It was at one of these establishments Hannan ran into the younger of the sisters, looked at their situation and figured out the 2, virtual recluses, must have cash lying about the Salvation Army Hall that doubled as their house, having nothing better to spend it on. One Saturday evening, this burglary turned to murder, the most brutal murder one can imagine. Annie Smythe came across Leo Hannan turning over the residential area of the church. He tied her up and gagged her. In all the commotion, Rosamund came onto the scene. Hannan grabbed a fire poker and ordered her back into the room. Knowing he'd been sprung, both sisters had recognised him, he went into Rosamund's room and smashed her skull in, then went back into the lounge where he proceeded to batter the bound Annie to death. Then, to feign the attack as being of a sexual nature, pulled Annie's panties down. In the Ferrari, the money stash they had was left untouched. Officially, the 2 dead sisters wouldn't be found for another 13 days. In a bizarre twist, the Smythe house was entered twice when the sisters lay dead. The day following, being a Sunday, when a member of the Salvation Army congregation somehow walked straight past the dead youngest sister slumped in the chair, went into the main hall, prayed there for a while, and left without noticing. Then the following weekend, some curious neighbours' children, on seeing the door and windows open to the hall, thinking the sisters were out, they decided to go inside and play. One guess what they found. Rather than tell their parents, they kept stum, preferring not to risk telling off. Despite a massive reward for the day of £500, no leads came forth. The case went cold. By now, you would have picked up on Hannan's proclivity to inflict maximum violence when pushed. This cold-blooded nature was again evident 6 years later. 17th of December 1948, still in Wairoa, retired railway worker and 69-year-old Herbert Brunton. Brunton had recently split up from his wife and taken residence in the New Zealand railway hut beside the Wairoa station. Brunton kept to himself. Hannan, well, as you know, he likes sniffing around railway stations for things to steal. As far as we can tell, this murder was premeditated. Knowing Brunton's small two-room hut was occupied, Hannan entered, armed with an axe, dispatched Brunton with 6 blows, and then ransacked the hut looking for money. In the end, all he found was a half-empty bottle of gin. A bloody fingerprint was located at the scene, but by the time the police went to fingerprint all the men in the township, Hannan had left the district. Despite having his fingerprint, he wasn't tied to the murder. It too went cold. Officially, all 3 of these murders are still on the books as unsolved. The revelations in Hannan's confessions not coming to light till well after his death, close to 4 decades after the murders, but we can be sure Hannan's death toll was 4, the modus being almost identical, Hannan being a known suspect in both cases at the time. If you would like to support me, I have a Buy Me a Coffee page, which should be appearing on your screen right now if you're viewing this on YouTube, and it's also in the description if you're listening to this on a podcast. Researching and producing podcasts like this, it does take time which YouTube chooses not to pay me for because the subject matter, i.e. serial killers, doesn't fit their unicorns and rivers of lemonade views of the world. A coffee would be a nice way of showing your appreciation to an old geezer in his Christchurch study. And speaking of Christchurch, the next episode is when I'm going to be doing a Christchurch pub promotion in the late 90s that went tits up, resulted in worldwide attention, a Darwin Award for stupidity. So, if scrotum's been stapled to a piece of wood, are your thing, it spins your wheels. Get your best leather bondage gear out from the box underneath your bed for this one. In the meantime, why not take a gaze or listen to a video from the vaults. This disturbing story of an exorcism in Auckland gone wrong, badly wrong. The forgotten story of Pastor Luke Lee, who tried to breathe life into a corpse, rotting corpse. Not one to view or listen to whilst having tea, I think. Thanks for tuning in today. I await your coffee. Bye for now.